So this one features a brigand as well. This is called the Screaming Red Tsen. Come, sit down, be comfortable, Rinpoche began. Now, today we must look at politics and diplomacy. We have no concern about politics and politicians. Almost all politicians are scheming, lying tomyors, but Paltrul knew politics, even though he avoided politicians. It is useful to know the ways in which tomyors think, especially if their behavior can affect your life or your freedom. There will be many politicians in Dharma centers, and you must learn to recognize political tomyors. Learn to recognize them and avoid them. Never trust any politicians, especially Dharma politicians. Yes, Rinpoche, I saw a little of politics when I was at art school. My tutor, Derek Crow, hated politics, but had to engage with it when it affected the illustration department. Yeah, so you've already seen this. It is disgusting, and you will see more with Buddhists in centers. Politics is the favorite occupation of tomyors who do not practice, and also tomyors who pretend to practice, and also tomyors who collect empowerments, and the tomyors who collect Dharma as information. You've met with this already, I think. Yes, Rinpoche, I have, although I've not really seen any Buddhist center yet. Yeah, you will discover this. There are politicians everywhere, small ones as well as big ones, cowardly ones and brave ones. All are tomyors. All can be dangerous and all can destroy Dharma. And was it like this in Tibet too, Rinpoche? Yeah, it's like this everywhere there are tomyors, and in Tibet there were many tomyors. The tomyors in Tibet would destroy each other's gompas. How can Buddhists do this? This is terrible, but the tomyors in Tibet did this. This is why the Chinese have control of Tibet now. This is because of the tomyors who fought each other to see who would be the ruling tomyors. Anyway, we do not need to speak more of this. Now, I will speak of Paltrul, and you will see how he understands politics. Paltrul was passing through the northern reaches of Kham with nothing but stones for company. He was avoiding the kind of events in which he took no interest, and giving no mind to the concerns of the professionally grandiose. He had no time for pseudo spiritual posturing, preferring the sight of drong on the high plains to the sight of monastic herds in their domestic institutions. A drong is a wild precursor to the yak, bigger and stronger than the yak. That's how he was. It just so happened that at a point where a brief rest seemed in order, Paltrul was invited to stay at some Hik Nyingma Gompa. Now this was just the type of venue Paltrul enjoyed. Relaxed atmosphere, minimal formality, and a distinct absence of high-rise thrones. Now, the usual translation of the word Gompa is monastery, but the word monastery tends to give rise to images of large institutions, extraordinary assemblages of rooms built into impressive mountainsides. That's the popular image of Tibetan monasteries. But the word Gompa literally means meditation place. In the Nyingma tradition, there are many diminutive Gompas, some little more than shrine rooms surrounded by a few huts. It was typical for such small Gompas to be attended by a mixed group, monks, nuns, and Gokha Changlo practitioners. Arrangements were often fairly ad hoc at such places, and often those monastics who'd taken only the basic Genyen ordination would marry without anyone causing any kind of unseemly ruckus about it. They would continue to wear their robes, but were otherwise family people. Such Gompas can still be found today, not only in the remote Himalayas, but also in and around the Kathmandu Valley of Nepal. The Gompa to which Paltrul was invited was a size up from many a tiny Gompa that the well-to-do might pass by as a hovel. But it had only enough room to accommodate 10 people. The head Lama, Namgyal Dorje, was a good, careful man, and his wife, Anitsomo, was devoted to her practice. They spared no effort to maintain the place in tidy order. They had a good association with the Drokpas, the local nomad tribes. The Drokpas put in requests for practitioners to visit their gars and made healthy contributions to the general upkeep of the Gompa. This was an arrangement that made everyone happy. The brigand camps also sent invitations, but Namgyal Dorje didn't consider it appropriate to have dealings with them. They occasionally took to rustling the Drokpas' yaks and drees, and that didn't go down too well. He didn't refuse the brigands. That would have been unwise, but neither did he send anyone to visit them. There was always a good reason. The monks were needed to perform rites for the dead, or for the crops, or for any one of a long list of reasons. Anyhow, such were the diplomatic arrangements of the Gompa according to the most circumspect tactics that Namgyal Dorje could devise. The small lakang, or main shrine room, was well kept, and they had a small gunkang, or protector house, which held statues of the Maza Dorsum, the three Nyingma protectors, and a large painted wooden statue of the local mountain protector, the Screaming Red Zen. The statue was very old. It had been made at a time when Bon practitioners used the place. The little Gompa had alternately been used by Buddhists and Bons down the centuries and had occasionally run into neglect. Originally, it had simply been a diminutive temple that held one large statue of the mountain protector, who had his residence in the subtle dimension of the nearby mountain. Since the obscure beginnings of clan memory, the local farmers had the habit of making offerings to the Screaming Red Zen at harvest time in order that their crops would be protected from hail, and so the door to the gunkang was always open. Hail may not seem too terrible to most people, but in certain parts of the world, hail is not the brief shower of petit pois that the British might experience. Hail in Tibet and the Himalayas can devastate crops. Hour-long assaults of falling ice pellets from the size of acorns to horse chestnuts can thrash a field of barley into slushy, fibrous pulp. Occasional lumps, the size of grapefruit, hurtle out of the sky, killing sheep and goats. In view of this, it's not difficult to understand that any local protective spirit who can be called upon to prevent such things is well regarded and called upon frequently. Kambas are nothing if not pragmatic when it comes to making offerings to local protectors, and if they don't deliver the goods, respect tends to dwindle rapidly. In one remote region, a local protector had failed to produce a decent harvest, and the villagers dragged his statue out of the temple and beat it conscientiously with chains. On a blustery day, a brigand galloped up to Namgyal Dorje's Gompa with a leathern bag dangling from his saddle. He dismounted with unmitigated swagger from an impressive stallion and unhitched the leathern bag. His saddle, from which he detached the mysterious bag, was decorated with the most impressive Derge ironwork and sumptuous Shigatse carpentry. He was a dashing young fellow. He wore an expression of the most profound insolence and impeccable nonchalance. His face was set off admirably by a fine moustache, well-oiled hair, and a large golden earring. He sported rakish leather boots and a dapper lambskin tuba draped back off his right shoulder. He walked with a long, relaxed stride, covering the short distance to the gunkang in a quick but unhurried manner. He entered without removing the aforementioned footwear, and, lacking any pretense of formal courtesy, addressed the local protector. Screaming Red Sen, this is the deal. You get an offering like this every month on the 29th day. I get to rustle yak without any problems. If you agree, take this shoulder of lamb. If you don't agree, kill me now. Here, on this spot, where I stand. I tell you in earnest, I'm a dangerous man. but my word is my word. And there it was. That was the deal. He obviously thought he'd rather die with his boots on. The brigand waited a while, motionless, with unblinking eyes. Then, in a careful yet leisurely manner, he unwrapped the leathern bag and deposited the shoulder of lamb in front of the local protector. He stood for a moment and said, "This is my vow then. If I break it, take my life. But if I keep it, always reward me with unrestrained banditry." Then turning on his heel, he left the gunkang, leapt onto his horse and galloped into the rising gale. That was the way of it. Now it so happened that there was a young scrap of a monk, no more than a boy. He'd been sitting in the gunkang at the time the brigand made his deal. He'd been cleaning and trimming the butter lamps, and consequently, the brash horseman hadn't seen him. The boy was quite taken aback by what he'd seen and heard, but decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He was afraid to say anything to anyone. After all, the screaming red sen hadn't killed the horseman on the spot. So, who was this brigand? The young monk had never seen such a thing before. He'd never even heard of such a thing before. What to do? Keep quiet? That seemed the best choice. After some time had passed, the monks began to notice the leg of lamb that appeared in the gunkang every month on the Day of the Protectors. Some had observed the audacious brigand who strode into the gunkang with his boots on. He came in the morning of the day, and they practiced in the evening. Some wondered what was going on. Some tied the two things together. After a while, everyone at the gompa fell to talking about it. And before long, the young monk piped up with what he had seen. The story was unbelievable, but there had been a lot of rustling going on. Some of the nomad families were getting rather more touchy about it. Having their herds of yaks and drees diminished was not a situation guaranteed to please most Drokpas. And parties of young men slung about with blades and primed muskets were riding out in a mean disposition, looking for culprits. Their blood was up, and blood was evidently going to be shed before much time had elapsed. After some weeks, these events came to the attention of Namgyal Dorje, and he in turn came to discuss the situation with Paltrul. What can be done? The rustler is in mystical cahoots with the screaming red sen, and I'm sorely vexed by my inability to handle the situation. What can be done, Rinpoche? What can be done? It was a dilemma, and Namgyal Dorje presented the awful fact of it to Paltrul in the hope of a supreme solution. The Drokpas are getting irate, to say the least, and the heads of the families are coming soon to ask for advice. I owe a duty to the local Drokpas, but I also owe a duty to the local protector. The brigand must be stopped, but how can he be stopped if he has the help of the protector? If I try to intervene, then the protector will be offended, and the pastures may not provide sufficient food for the animals. There seems to be no answer. Yeah, Paltrul commented. So it is in the world. You can please all of the people some of the time, and you can please some of the people all of the time, but you can't please all the people all the time. Namgyal Dorje sat silently before Paltrul, waiting for something. He didn't know what, but he hoped that Paltrul would think of some way out of the situation. Finally, he put his cards on the table. Rinpoche, can't you punish this brigand? Paltrul looked a trifle quizzical at this question. What for? Namgyal Dorje was obviously surprised by this response. What for? He's a thief. Paltrul eyed Namgyal Dorje carefully. He's just like us then. Why should we punish one of our own? Namgyal Dorje was uncertain how he should proceed with the discussion at this point, because he had no concept of the nature of the theft to which Paltrul was alluding. But he attempted, we're not rustlers. Paltrul laughed. No, not of yak and drees, but we're rustlers nonetheless. Namgyal Dorje was silent. Paltrul obviously had something in mind about which he was not being explicit. They sat together without further exchange for an uncomfortable duration. Namgyal Dorje struggled with what it could be. Paltrul included himself as a rustler, so whatever it was they rustled could not be animals and could not really constitute theft in the usual sense of the word. You see, Paltrul said at length, this brigand, he really is quite a good practitioner. He's without fear. He keeps his vows. He's simple and straightforward in his dealings, and he's not compromised himself with anyone. I wish the same could be said of us. Curiouser and curiouser. This was becoming a miasma of perplexity. Namgyal Dorje wondered how he might have compromised himself, but could not think of anything. What concerns you in all this? Asked Paltrul after another difficult silence. Namgyal Dorje didn't need much time to find an answer. Protecting the droplets from rustling. Paltrul eyed Namgyal Dorje quizzically. Yes, and? Namgyal Dorje started to think about the droppers, and it gradually dawned on him that Paltrul might be insinuating something to the effect that Namgyal Dorje's little Gompa relied on donations from these people. Yes, repeated Paltrul, you rustle in your way, I rustle in mine, and he rustles in his. Most people rustle pleasurable experiences. Some spiritual types even try to rustle teachings. Namgyal Dorje looked ashamed at these remarks. It is true, he said with a deep sigh. I am a rustler too. I rustle donations. I rustle everything you've named. But I'm neither fearless, nor do I keep any vow as diligently as this brigand. He bowed his head and fell silent. But, said Paltrul, you're a good man, and you're not dishonest. You understand the nature of your situation and your motivation well. So, I will do what I can to help. However, you must make a vow now, and one that you will always keep. Promise me that your monks will visit the brigand gars, as well as the encampments of the droppers. It is not right to neglect people simply because of their brigandage. These people need the influence of the teachings as much, if not more, than others. Yes, Namgyal Dorje agreed. This is certainly true. I promise to send monks to the brigand camp when they request visits. I recognize my fault in partiality towards my nomad benefactors, and I recognize that I have allowed myself to live in a compromised position. Paltrul nodded and smiled, and the plan was underway. The 29th day was close, so Paltrul gave some advice as to how he would proceed. On the eve of the day of the protector, no one at all was to go into the Gunkang. Paltrul would practice there for the entire day himself. No other rites would be necessary or welcome. He'd wait for the brigand to arrive with his shoulder of lamb and deal with the protector in his own way. Paltrul had no great anxiety when it came to local protectors, or brigands for that matter. He'd seen both before and neither caused him any loss of sleep. He was especially unimpressed by local spirits, whose vanity was immense and whose intelligence was such that they could be bought for a piece of meat they couldn't even eat. Paltrul arrived just before dawn and sat silently, obscured by the large drum which was used in the invocations. Dawn arrived, and with it the brigand. He galloped into the courtyard and sprang from his horse in the manner anticipated from the rumours that had become legendary. He strode into the Gunkang with his leathern bag and was about to proffer its contents to the screaming red Sen when Paltrul spoke. You keep your vows well, Master Horseman. The brigand was surprised, but reasonably unruffled. What is it to you? Nothing much, really, replied Paltrul, apart from the issue of this local protector being directly answerable to me. This was an unexpected answer for the brigand. This old yogi was either insane or he was someone to be reckoned with. Is that a fact? Paltrul bored him clean through with a steely gaze. Yes, that's a fact. The brigand considered these words briefly and adopted a defiant stance, which belied his slightly eroded sense of ease. And so what does that add up to exactly, you loose-mouthed pile of yak dung? Paltrul smiled. It adds up to the fact that your pact with this little imp is over. If you rustle now, you do it without the assistance of this curious creature. The brigand pondered the import of this statement. Was it true, or was it a piece of spiritual bravado? Strong words for a ragged, flea-bitten old-timer without a blade. Paltrul roared with laughter at this piece of sarcasm. I don't need a blade to get the edge on a youngster like you. The brigand's ire was touched. I'm real scared now, you mangy old marmot. Paltrul wasn't moved. You bet your damn life you're scared. What goddamn brilliant deduction leads you to that conclusion, you doddering old dickhead? Nothing that brilliant, my fine young fellow. It's just that you've volunteered your life to the hands of this local imp. But he's nothing but a menial servant of a minion of those I invoke. I would imagine that would make a person nervous. Something about this yogi was becoming very disconcerting. He wasn't backing off. Neither was he becoming angry. He was speaking to the bandit as if he were some rising nomad Johnny-come-lately. Was he lying? Was he stark raving mad? He didn't seem to be mad, and if he was lying, he'd surely be dead by now. After all, the screaming red sen obviously had the power to protect his rustling. He knew the power of this protector from his own experience, and yet here was this old yogi trivializing the protector as an imp. A little nothing. That must mean that Paltrul had far greater power than this local protector. Maybe this was the end of his life. Paltrul knew the brigand's thought and replied, no. Paltrul smiled. There's no need for you to fear from your life from me. I have no wish to kill you. You could do a great deal of good one day if you give up this nonsense. What's it to me if a fellow like you rustles every goddamn yak and dree he sees? But let me ask you a question. Is the money that good? And hasn't it even started to get a little tedious yet? The brigand sat down. What do you want of me, Ame? He asked, recognizing this was no ordinary everyday situation. Paltrul took his time. Nothing. It would be useful if you give the Drokpas a break with this rustling of yours. But come now, what do you want for yourself? Surely there must be something beyond this business of droving yak and dree from one place to another, and then teaching your children to do the same when you're too old to do it yourself? Or is that what you really want? The brigand had no good answers. So Paltrul continued. You know, you can do this brigandry business blindfolded, but you're not ready for the life of a yogi. We'll meet again one day, though, and when we do, you may want to receive teachings from me. Until then, try to do as little harm as you can, and remember our meeting. The brigand left. The rustling stopped. Everyone seemed quite contented for a while. Namgyal Dorje kept his vow to Paltrul and sent monks to visit the brigand camps. And in turn, the brigands turned their attention to the Chinese borderlands. Brigands, after all, are brigands and have to continue the business of brigandage somewhere or other. Now, Rinpoche began, there are several things here, aren't there? Yes, I said, putting down what I hope would be a royal flush and spreading my cards with as little timidity as I could manage under Rinpoche's penetrating gaze. He'd stopped shouting at me, but there was something about his gaze that still unnerved me. There are questions in this story about spiritual qualities in unlikely people such as the brigand. He's both fearless and able to keep vows. Then there's the Lama at the Gompa, who's well-meaning, but whose diplomacy compromises him with regard to his spiritual integrity. Then there's the question of relying on unenlightened protectors for mundane concerns. Rinpoche gave me a look which confirmed that all this was obvious. Yeah, and then, he said in a way of an open-ended prompt. And then what? Right, well, yes, there were a few other ideas, so I put these out on the table as well. But I'd laid out what I thought were my trump cards. So it was no great confidence that I posited some further thoughts on the story. Well, Rinpoche, it strikes me that Paltrul is very gentle with Namgyal Dorje, when the head lama is obviously sitting in a mess of his own devising. I mean, if he'd sent monks out to the brigand guards all along, the situation may not have arisen. Rinpoche smiled. Yeah, possible, but to behave correctly is no guarantee that others will do the same. He laughed. You will discover this. This time I had a quick reply. Yes, I can see that, but the Lama would have been in a more powerful situation if the brigands had been obliged to his impartiality towards them. He could have approached them directly with the depredations of one of their young bloods. Rinpoche roared with laughter at this. Good, good, good. Maybe one day you'll become Prime Minister of England. But we're not here for you to learn diplomacy, even though it is useful in dealing with Tomyos. If you're here to learn the nature of things, that is good. But if you want to learn politics, you will have to go and spend your time with Indira Gandhi. But I think this is not what you would enjoy. Rinpoche was not angry. He was serious in manner and determinedly pointed me in a different direction. I'd evidently complicated the whole issue, and the question turned out to be far more simple than I'd imagined. I suddenly realized that it was simply a question of power. Namgyal Dorje lacks power. He lacks power to refuse the brigands. He lacks power to face the droppers. He lacks power to face the local protectors. Oh yeah, Rinpoche exclaimed with a smile. So, I continued, it's not so much a question of the Lama's failure to be impartial, but his being unable to be upfront about things. Impartiality is obviously preferable, but impartiality is based on power, the power to risk offending the droppers. Rinpoche gave me a sideways glance. You can't simply decide to be impartial. You have to have the strength, capacity, and realization to be impartial. Power, Rinpoche concluded, relies on the ability to let go of everything. You must be able to allow everything to fall apart. Power rests on the ability to let everything for which you've worked be destroyed. You can't have power whilst there's anything that you want to keep intact. This is why Paltrul has the power to command this local protector. Paltrul cannot be bought. Now it all makes sense to me. This is why he can speak to the brigand in such a forthright way. Paltrul isn't afraid of death. He knows that death might result from this confrontation, but that doesn't concern him. Rinpoche nodded. Yeah, this is it. But there was something interesting in what you said before. Paltrul is very gentle with Namgyal Dorje. Why? And that was a question. Well, he was gentle, but he was also rather non-committal. Rinpoche donned his quizzical expression. Yeah, and so, why was he not fierce when he is fierce with the brigand? As soon as Rinpoche shuffled the deck in this way, it all gelled. As soon as I compared Paltrul's manner with these two individuals, it dawned on me. This was also a question of power. I spread my hand on the table again. Paltrul was gentle with Namgyal because the Lama didn't really have much power. He was a simple, good-hearted country abbot trying to keep everyone happy. Rinpoche nodded. And the brigand? He was fierce with the brigand because the brigand, in his own limited way, was very powerful. The brigand's power lay in his ability to lay his life on the line, and the Lama's lack of power came from his desire to maintain the status quo. By Rinpoche's expression, I could tell that I'd given the right answer, but he had something else to throw at me that I'd not expected. So, Rinpoche chuckled, why was this bad Kunzang Dorje fierce with you when you first came here? Somehow I realized I had no choice about the answer I was obliged to give. The only problem was the wording. Fortunately, there was no time to think it out. I toyed for a split second with, because you perceive me to be powerful in some way, Rinpoche, but that seemed instantaneously cretinous, so I went for broke, because I am powerful enough. Rinpoche chuckled and poured 2 beers. Sometimes, yes. Maybe one day, all the time. Power's a strange subject, an elusive commodity, I ventured. Yeah, Rinpoche observed. Some people have power without realizing it. People who simply are what they are. And some people, I commented, risking the continuance of Rinpoche's statement, are powerful because of their neuroses, but their power is self-destructive. People who sulk have a certain kind of power, but they get nothing from that power but sadness and bitterness. Rinpoche nodded almost sadly. Yeah, it's good to remember this. I've thought about this question of power many times since my discussions with Rinpoche. I've realized that power has got very little to do with the power to, but rather power not to. It's not a question of supernormal abilities. It's a question of being prepared to die in the next moment, to be totally insignificant. The power to be unafraid of looking like an idiot. The power not to care about what people think or say. It's not a question about being physically, intellectually, or emotionally strong, but of being open to annihilation. Everything has to matter and not matter at the same time. There have been some hard lessons to learn in this department. I was far from the end of learning, but at least I knew the shape of the lesson. Later that afternoon, I asked, this brigand, he wouldn't happen to be the same brigand who gave the Patrul the silver horse's hoof? It almost seems if you told me 3 stories about the same man in reverse order. Rinpoche shrugged. Yeah, you mentioned this before, but there were many brigands. Patrul wandered a lot in Kham and Golok. There were many brigands there, you know. Maybe one went on to become a yogi, maybe not. Some great lamas come from brigand families, and some great yogis were formerly brigands. A thin drizzle was blurring the end of the afternoon into night. It became suddenly cold. Food arrived and we ate. Potatoes, dark green vegetable matter, and a few emaciated shreds of goat. Having eaten, Rinpoche fished around in a pile of things in the dim of a corner, made incomprehensible by the light of a guttering candle. Electricity was an intermittent occurrence in Sopema. His hand finally alighted on the sought-after shape. It was placed on the table. Old monk Indian rum. Kunchok Dorje once quipped that old monk should be called young monk, because what would an old monk want with rum? That was the first night that I arrived in Sopema. Rinpoche laughed. Ala la ho, kelpazang. Then we wrapped blankets around ourselves against the cold and damp, and made emptiness of the old monk Indian rum. What is important, Rinpoche concluded, is that you're able to have the fearlessness of a brigand and the heart of a kind mother. Do you think you can be like this? Yes, Rinpoche, it seems entirely possible, I grinned, whilst I have the mind of an old monk.